Pandium is the only integration platform for B2B SaaS companies that facilitates faster code-first development of integrations. So in this video, I am going to walk you through the engineer's experience of using Pandium to write an integration so you can see just how easy Pandium makes it. Let's pretend you have been hired as a dev for HubSpot, and HubSpot's using Pandium to write an integration with Apollo.io. This makes sense because HubSpot is a tool for storing and organizing information about contacts in other companies, and then Apollo.io is a service that allows its users to access the information they have about other companies. Any Apollo.io subscriber would want to be able to get the information they have in Apollo.io ported over to HubSpot. That means those people will be more excited to set up a HubSpot account once this integration exists. Now, before we make our HubSpot Apollo integration, we need to make sure that Pandium source control on our account is set up correctly. So here's how we get to source control. We go to settings in our sidebar menu under setup, and then we go to source control. Source control is a tool which uses the integration code in your remote repository to make releases that can be run on Pandium. This is what lets us write all the code for our integrations locally in whatever IDE you like, push it to the remote repository of our choosing, and then smoothly deploy it to run on Pandium. So in this example, we're going to be working with a GitHub repo. That means we need to be sure source control is connected to GitHub. We see here that it is. Another powerful feature about source control comes into play when you're starting a new integration. It can actually set up a scaffolding of folders, files, and clients that can talk to APIs. We're going to see in action how this will jumpstart our project so we can cut straight to the fun parts of writing the code. Since we've confirmed the source control is connected to our GitHub, now we can create the Pandium record for our new integration. So we're going to go to integrations. We're going to click create. We're going to choose internal here since this integration is being developed on Pandium. Here, we're going to select the connector for the system that we're integrating with. So that would be Apollo.io. We're also going to need to pick the connector for our system, which we're pretending that's HubSpot. You'll notice we can choose between basic and auth. Today, we're just going to use basic, but it's nice to know that there's a variety of auth options that Pandium supports. This next section is where we specify the remote repo the integration code should be pulled from. This location is where source control will look for code changes to create new builds or releases. Now, I'm going to work in Pandium's sample integration repo, so we'll grab that and put it here. And I'm going to have to specify the branch that we're going to work on. So let's go ahead and make a new branch now. We can call it Apollo HubSpot. We'll put that there. And now we need to specify the folder where our integration is going to live within this repo. So let's just take a look at the pattern that we have in the repo as it exists. The folder for each integration here is all caps, so we'll follow that. We want it to be in a folder called Apollo HubSpot. Here, this is specifying the schedule on which an installation of the integration will run. We can add custom options if we want, but for now, we're just going to leave it as the default. In fact, I'm even going to make it for new installations that it'll pause by default, but we can come back and change this at any time. Go ahead and click create. Now, this screen here, this is for provisioning. This is used for a lot of OAuth connectors. It's where you enter integration level credentials for a connector. So if it's an OAuth connector, that's where you'd be putting the client ID or the client secret. In this case, we're just working with basic connectors, so we don't need to enter anything here. Another really nice thing about this screen, though, is this show secret keys button. This tells us the names of the secrets for each connector so that we know how to reference them when we're writing code. I'll show you more about what that looks like once we're actually working in an IDE. All right, so now we have a record of our Pandium integration, and this is what will be used to run code. So at this point, we could go to our Apollo HubSpot branch and start writing code. But it would be all the tedious and repetitive things that you always have to do at the start of a project. Setting up the file structure and the package JSON. I never like doing this stuff. I feel like it kills my project's momentum. Fortunately, the power of Pandium's source control is going to do all that for us. So let's click on Setup Integration Repo. You'll see here we have a lot of options to choose from. Pandium doesn't care what language you want to work in. These are all supported. We're going to work in TypeScript for this example. This brings us back to the source control page, and we can see here that a sync has started, and it is building a release for our Apollo HubSpot integration. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's happening according to the logs. It says it's setting up a quick start repo for our integration. It even says it was successful already. So let's go back to our branch, and we see now there is an Apollo HubSpot folder here where there never was before. Let's see what we got. We've got this nice file structure, and here we've even got some clients that have been imported, and the clients are even making some API calls. Why don't we go ahead and take this code for a test drive? Source control has completed its run. That means it's finished making a release for our integration based on the code that we just looked at. And we can see that release here. Now that we have a release, we can create a tenant. A tenant is an installation of an integration. So we'll choose our release, give it a name. Here we need to enter the secrets that connect this particular installation of the integration to each of our APIs. This is the tenant settings page. This is where we can configure this particular installation of the integration to do different things. As you can see right now, it's just some placeholders at the moment. We're going to leave them as they are, but we'll talk more in a bit about how to customize this for our integration. We can now run our connected tenant. All right, it's finished that run. Let's take a look at the logs and see what it did. We'll scroll to the top to see what's going on here. So here it says it's going to fetch and log out 10 HubSpot contacts, and then here we have a variety of objects logged out. Each one of them is a HubSpot contact. And then if we go a little further down, we can see it says it's going to fetch and log out 10 Apollo contact names. And here they are. Wow. So not only do we have the start of the project in the repo that we looked at, we've already got code that is fetching real information from each API. Now I feel really ready to get going writing our integration in our IDE. We'll start by pulling all those starter files from GitHub for us. So we'll fetch our origin, get that Apollo HubSpot branch, pull that down, and there we go. There's our Apollo HubSpot repo. We've got some errors here. That's because we haven't installed our node modules yet. So let's take care of that. Great. So we see that resolves all those errors we had. Now, earlier, I promised that we were going to talk about the tenant settings page and where those configurations came when we were creating that tenant, installing our integration. That comes from the Pandium YAML right here. So you can see there's a configuration here called free text field 1, free text field 2, boolean 1, boolean 2. Those match what we just saw on the tenant settings page. We can add any configurations we want here. Your customers will see these options when they're installing the integration. The customers make selections, and then we, the engineers, can use those to make the integration behave differently for each installation. Let's add a log level configuration. That's a nice thing that's just good to have, I think, for almost any integration. All right, great. So this is a configuration that will be useful for us in our integration. Let's see how our tenant settings page changes. We want to go ahead and commit our changes. We're going to push them up to our remote repository in GitHub. Back on the Integration Hub, we want to make a new release based on the code that we just pushed to GitHub. We don't need to set up the integration repo because we've already got files there. So we'll click Build Release. Here we can put in a tag that says what's different about this release. So we can add that we have a log level now. Clicking build release takes us once again to our source control page. We've got another run kicked off. It is building our integration with the log level config this time. So we'll wait for that to complete. Now that we have that run complete, let's go back to our integration. We can see there's our new release. Let's put our test tenant on that updated release. So here's the tenant settings page again. It looks just like it did before, no changes, but that's because we haven't updated the release. So we'll put it on the new one now. And here we see the log level config that we put in. And it's defaulting to info. Let's go ahead and put it at debug. Save those changes. And let's take a look at our IDE again. I want to show you how we can access the debug value we just selected for that new log level config. It's going to be an environmental variable, so we'll use process.env to get at it. And then the name will be prefixed with pancfg for config, plus the name of the config. So that would be log level, pancfg log level. I also said earlier that I wanted to show you how we access the tenant secrets. So if you'll recall, on the reprovision connector screen, we have this handy button, show secret keys. This is the name of the secret when it's provided at runtime. So let's drop that in here. And just to make it easier to read things, we'll remove a couple other logs. Now, what's going to be the best way to run the code with the changes that we have just made? You've already seen one way we can do this. We could push the code to GitHub, make a new release, put our tenant on the release, and run it. That works, but it's a lot to do every single time you want to test a new change you've made. Probably when you're writing an integration or another project, you just run your code locally on your machine. That also works, but then we have to manually type in all the secrets and configs and environmental variables. That's annoying to do when we know that Pandium has an instance of the integration, the tenant, with the valid configs and creds. So what we want is a way to get at that information which we know would be provided to a sink when our code is run on Pandium, while still working on the local machine. Let me introduce you to the Pandium CLI. This is going to give us the best of both worlds. We will start by logging in to Pandium, where in the environment we're working in. This opens up a browser where we can log in. We've already been working on the integration hub, so we're already logged in there. And let's show that we can get information from the integration hub using the Pandium CLI. Let's look at our test tenant. Its ID is 6592. Pandium get tenants, followed by our tenant ID. We see here the name test tenant for the integration Apollo HubSpot. Now, the whole thing I think is great about the Pandium CLI is that it lets us run code locally with changes that we've made. So let's do Pandium local build to compile all the changes that we just made to our code. Now let's do Pandium local run, followed by that ID number, 6592. It's going to tell us that it's going to run this tenant and refresh the secrets for it first. Yes, we do want to do that. All right, so we got some logs here. The run mode is in normal. We saw that before. And then here's the process.env log level debug. That is the setting that we entered here on Pandium, but it's available here on our local machine. And likewise, we can see the environmental variable of the secret for the tenant that is also logged out here. That's the secret that we entered on Pandium when we connected it, but we have access to it here in our local run. So now you know how to use the Pandium CLI to test your code locally while using environmental variables provided by Pandium. This is going to make it so easy to work in your own IDE and build on these starter files that we got from source control. You've got a great jump start since Pandium gave you a whole client for each of the APIs. You can start coding, you'll knock out this integration in no time. Here's a quick look of what my completed integration looks like. You can see we got a company sync flow here that'll fetch information from Apollo and then load it into HubSpot for us, I can still use the Pandium CLI to build this and run it locally. So it's building. Now it's going to run. So we can see it's doing a lot more stuff now, but I don't really need to run this locally anymore. What I want to do at this point is push my code and make this integration available to customers. So now that source control has finished its run, we can go back to our integration and we can see the release that's been created for it. When we put a tenant on this release, it will run the code for the completed integration. In fact, let's go ahead and make this the default release for our integration. That means when we create new tenants, they'll start running this code automatically. So that raises the question, how do we get new tenants? Well, one way you've already seen. Right here on the integration hub, we can click Create Tenant. That's how we made our first test tenant. Another way to get new tenants is with Pandium's optional in-app marketplace. The in-app marketplace lists all the integrations that you've got available for your customers so that they can identify the ones they need, install them for themselves, and set up all the configs that they need. Now, you'll notice we don't have Apollo listed here. That's because we haven't published it to our marketplace yet. So let's go ahead and take care of that. We click here for Publish. We can also add some categories to make it easier for the customers to find. You can even add a logo. There are a lot of good things that your marketing team might choose to add to the integration through this marketplace setup page. We save these changes. Let's go back to the in-app marketplace. Right now, we're pretending to be a HubSpot customer, and we can see that we now have the option to install the Apollo HubSpot integration. This shows us what the tenant settings page looks like to customers on the in-app marketplace. We can leave these settings as they are. And here the customer gets the option of how often they want the integration to run. So now the HubSpot Apollo integration is listed under our installed apps. And if we want, we can take a look at the logs for the integration. This is the run that we just triggered. And we can see these logs look exactly what they looked like when we were running the completed integration locally with the Pandium CLI, only now it's running on Pandium. It's also worth noting if we go back to the integration hub and look at our tenants, there's a new tenant there. And that's reflective of the fact that we just installed the integration through the in-app marketplace. So there you have it. That's the whole process of creating an integration on Pandium. And if you want more details for any of it, you can check out our docs at docs.pandium.com.